Okay, so this video is gonna cover questions 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are just like the stepping stones to get to completing the square. So it's like, do you understand the pieces of it? So looking at number 2, we have x minus 3 squared equals 25. So if we think about it, that means that we have this number that we're not really sure what it equals, but when we square it, it needs to equal 25. So that tells us that means that we should either have a positive 5 in here or a negative 5 in here, which means that x minus 3 has to equal either a positive 5 or x minus 3 has to equal negative 5. Once we set up our two equations, we just solve like we're back in algebra 1. So we're adding 3 to both sides for both equations. And we get x equals 8 and x equals -2. Remember, we can always check our work in these problems, so we can plug in 8 and -2 up here for x. So if I plug in 8 here, 8 minus 3 is 5, 5 squared equals 25. Or I can plug in the -2. If I plug in -2 minus 3 is -5, and -5 squared is a positive 25. All right, looking at number 3. This is part of the last lesson we did for lesson 15, right before we started getting ready for this quiz. So our brain should tell us that there is no number that when we multiply it by itself is 24. So if we wanted to double check, we could use our calculator and we could go and say, well, what's the square root of 24? And when we put that in, the square root of 24, we get a decimal and we can't put it back into a fraction because it's an irrational number. So we can't do anything with this. I remember the directions said, you read the directions, that you cannot round decimals. So therefore we have to leave it as the square root of 24. So technically we're taking the square root of this and the square root of this. Because the square root and a square kind of cancel each other out. So we get x equals the square root of 24. But remember, we always want, most of the time when we have quadratics, we have two answers. So we want the positive and negative square root of 24. Just like over here, we have the positive and -5. All right, question 4. So some of you might start off by saying, oh, we need to box this and do x plus 5 and x plus 5. And you can do it that way. It's just going to take you a really long time to do it, because once you do that x plus 5, x plus 5, once you get your C value, then you have to subtract 16, and then you have to go back and factor or whatever you want to do to solve it. There's something way easier than to do all that. And that's to get this to look like problem number 2, where we just had this by itself. So in order to get this by itself, we can add 16 to both sides. So I would get x plus 5 squared equals 16. And now it's the same exact steps we just did for number 2. We just square root both sides, and then we just solve the two equations. So we're going to square root both sides. Remember, square and square root kind of cancel each other out. Square root 16. So we get our two equations. X plus 5 equals 4, because that's what the square root of 16 is, but the square root of 16 could also be -4. And then we're back to algebra 1, and we're just solving by subtracting 5 from both sides. So that means x equals -1 and x equals -9. Remember, you can check your work, plug it in up here. If I put -1, -1 plus 5 is 4. 4 squared minus 16 is 0. And then I can plug also in -9 in. -9 plus 5 is -4. -4 squared is positive 16. Positive 16 minus 16 is 0. So that works. All right, then number 5. This is, again, the thing that we did in lesson 15. We want to square root both sides. But when we square root 45, we don't get a pretty answer. We can go check what we get. The square root of 45 as this irrational answer. I can't put it back into a fraction. I'm not allowed to round, so I'm going to leave it as the square root of 45. So that's going to be x plus 8 equals the square root of 45. Anytime you write the square root of 45, you should start getting in the habit of writing plus minus in front of it. because it's always a positive and negative version of it when we're trying to solve for something. So now we're trying to get x by itself, which means I need to subtract 8. Some of you are going to want to write -8 over here. That's really not good practice. We want to write it in the front of it. So it's going to be x equals -8 plus or minus the square root of 45. Now, if you write plus or minus the square root of 45 minus 8, it's technically not wrong as long as you're careful and this doesn't go over this. So that's why it's just safer to do it this way. There's no chance that your square root will go over your -8 if it's in front of it. Right, so this, we don't want this to happen because that is technically wrong. All right, so that's it for 2, 3, 4, and 5.